Hi, everyone. I am Michael Roux, the Marketing and Sales Manager at the University of Illinois Press. Thank you for joining our Spring 2021 Publishing Symposium and the panel Book Marketing in a Virtual World. And a special thank you to our panelists, Dr. Burgos, Dr. Finnegan, Dr. Flynn, and Dr. Freeman for sharing their expertise with us this evening. Each of the panelists were in a different part of the publishing process when the pandemic hit, so they'll bring a unique perspective to this conversation. The focus of the session will be less about how the University of Illinois Press markets books in a virtual world, and really more about how authors market and think about marketing their books and scholarship in a virtual space. Following the introductions, we will discuss marketing for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll reserve the last 10 or 20 minutes for a Q&A session. You can enter your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen throughout the event. And a note, this panel is being recorded and will be shared on our social media platforms in the days ahead. So on to the introductions. Adrian Burgos Jr. is a professor of history at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and author of 3 books in U.S. Latino and sport history, the most recent being Play Ball in the Barrios and the Big Leagues, published by Smithsonian Scholarly Press in 2020, which he co-authored with Margaret Salazar Porcio. Kara A. Finnegan is a professor in the Department of Communication at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and sole author of 3 books, 2 of them published by the University of Illinois Press: Making Photography Matter, A Viewer's History from the Civil War to the Great Depression, which was published in 2015, and Photographic Presidents, Making History from Daguerreotype to Digital, which will be published here in May 2021. Karen Flynn is an associate professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies and the Department of African American Studies at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and author of Moving Beyond Borders, A History of Black, Canadian, and Caribbean Women in the Diaspora, published by University of Toronto Press in 2011. And Dr. Flynn is working on her 2nd book right now. And Tyrone McKinley Freeman is assistant professor of philanthropic studies at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and author of Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow. And that was published by University of Illinois Press in 2020. So again, thank you to all of the panelists for being part of this discussion. I'd like to start with a question for all of you about writing for the public on op-ed pages and in other public media spaces. We at the University of Illinois Press often suggest to authors that they pitch op-eds tying their books to current conversations in the media or to recent political flashpoints. We found that helps give visibility to the book, but also helps establish authors as experts in their field. And we had an example of that, a good one, a few years ago. We published a book about the topic of sexting, and the author wrote in a lot of public media outlets, and we found that kind of following that writing, she kind of became a go-to expert on sexting, specifically teen sexting. So it really can give both the books and authors good visibility. On the other hand, we occasionally get pushback from authors who suggest that their either field of study or their departments maybe privilege scholarly writing in journals more than public writing because the public writing doesn't count as much toward tenure consideration. So I guess I want to ask all of you, what is your experience writing about your book content in public-facing publications, and how does your field of study or academic unit view that writing? So if we could, we'll start with Dr. Burgos.
Thank you for your question and for having me on this panel. My work is on Latinos in baseball and thinking about the history of the community and from the community level to the major leagues, to the Negro leagues. And so for me, public facing work has been a vital part of the work I had to do. And I have been fortunate to be in a department where they embrace that aspect of my scholarship to be public facing. And so in the lead up to the most recent book, Play Ball in the Barrios and Big Leagues, I have written articles that have been basically, I've been sought out to write for Memories and Dreams, which is the yearbook that the periodical that the Baseball Hall of Fame publishes based on my expertise on Latinos in baseball and in the Negro Leagues. I also spent 3 years working with a digital brand called La Vida Baseball, where I wrote a column called El Profe, and which is Spanish for the professor. And again, bringing the scholarship to bear on what's contemporary issues. And that really was the basis of my collaboration with the Smithsonian for their project that will finally open, we're hoping, this coming late summer, where it's an exhibit called Play Ball. And so it's been a collaboration that's been rooted in a number of years, but it's about facing the public with scholarship and informing them about the history of Latinos, the history of their impact, and vice versa, the impact that that participation has had on their communities, both in the US and in the Caribbean.
Thank you. Dr. Freeman, comments on writing for the public?
Sure, thank you, and good evening, everyone. My work is about the history of philanthropy in communities of color, and so I use the example of Madam C.J. Walker, a early 20th century African-American entrepreneur, as a gateway into a rich and deeply rooted historical tradition of giving among African-Americans. And so before I started thinking about op-eds, I thought very clearly about my audience. So that's what I would say to viewers tonight. Who is your audience? You know, my book extended out of my dissertation. We all know the only audience for a dissertation are the committee members and your mother, right? So you gotta think differently about the book, and who do you really want to reach? And as I was writing, I started sharing chapters at academic conferences, professional conferences, giving circles, community groups, congregations, and my audience quickly emerged. And so for me, I created this avatar of a Black woman in her 30s, educated, professional, raising her family, doing her thing, but deeply rooted in the community, in the sorority and church and that sort of thing. And so really, when it came time to start thinking about marketing the book, I started asking myself, not only what does she want to know in terms of how I want to write it, but where can I find her? Where would I write to reach her? And I knew that if I got that right, the other audiences that I'm also interested in, professional fundraisers, foundations, advancement folks, my own colleagues in the field, historians and others, I think they would follow because they're all trying to understand her as well. So I'm fortunate my institution has a relationship with the conversation. And so there's been actively involved in publishing pieces for the conversation. And I had a chance to do that and get some of my work out there early. Also, I did a week-long forum for Black perspectives on Madam Walker, where I brought in other scholars who had examined Madam Walker's life, and we did this week-long investigation in her life, which was really fun. But then when the book came out, I started thinking about my key philanthropy audiences, and there's 5 major publications in the field of philanthropy, and my school and we have good relationships with them, and so I was able to work with my colleagues. That was the other thing I would say: get a team, get some people who can help you. For me, it was my colleagues on campus from the external affairs and media relations folks. They opened some doors for me. They helped with these pitches, and they helped me develop a plan. And so I was able to get on all 5 placements there. And then some other things just kind of grew from that as people were coming. So my campus does value public scholarship, and I'm with an interdisciplinary field. So my own school it was developing its approach as a newly founded unit on campus, and so there's a little leeway there. So I'm grateful to be a part of a civically engaged campus that values that, but I still had to make a pretty clear argument for that. So I recognize that tension. I would just also say, who do you really want the book to reach? And if you can strike a balance, if you're not at a place that places as much value on public scholarship, if you could find a way to still reach out to those audiences that you're interested in beyond the academy, I think you'll find benefit, because when you get with readers who can reflect your book back to you through their eyes and raise things you never even thought about, it's really a blessing. It's a special thing. Great,
thank you. Dr. Finnegan, what's been your experience writing for public outlets?
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear other folks talk about this, because I think we're all in different phases and doing different stuff, but for the same goal of sharing our work more widely. outside of the academy. A lot of my what we might call my public writing in the past has actually not been writing. It's been webcasting, participating in online discussions. For about the last 15 years, I've been affiliated with a nonprofit media literacy site called Reading the Pictures, a site that started in the blogging era and then has evolved into a major resource for photojournalists, photo editors, academics, people trying to understand how, in my case, how photographs participate in public culture and public life. And so to the extent that I've been having a lot of conversations over time, I've been able to tap into that network a little bit as I've developed this book that Michael mentioned is coming out next month, which is on the way that photography and the presidency grew up together. So my public writing, that hasn't always been writing, and then combined with that, what I've been doing specifically to prepare for the book launch, with great help from Heather and the marketing and publicity folks here at U of I Press, is to think about that audience question that Professor Freeman mentioned, right? Who is that imaginary person who will read and buy your book, and what podcasts do they listen to? Where else might they find you? So I have been, with the help of the press and some of the pitching skills that I developed as a Public Voices Fellow with the op-ed project last year, pitching podcasts, trying to think through outlets, pitching pieces based on the book, and I've had pretty good success so far. So I think the one piece of advice I would give folks is figure out who your audience is, who are the kinds of people you want to read the book, figure out where they are, and then once you find those outlets, for example, the podcasts I've been pitching, once you find those outlets, figure out how those outlets work, see if you can talk their language a little bit. And what I found doing that is so far, I'm 100% in my pitches, right? So whatever I'm selling, they're interested in buying. And what that's it, not paying, of course. But what that suggests is, that there is a real interest in folks like us who do this kind of work, who do work in cultural studies, history, media studies, et cetera. And what you need to do, I think, is kind of figure out your story and how your story intersects with the needs and interests of that ideal reader, those potential readers.
Excellent, thank you. And Dr. Flynn, what is your experience writing for public outlets?
Okay. First, thanks to all the 60+ people who are here with us this evening on Zoom. I always appreciate the folks who come out, to be with us here. And Michael, thanks for the invitation. So I actually started working, well, not necessarily writing. So I like to say back in the day. So back in the day when I was at York University as a graduate student, I had a radio show. So I always wanted to be in the public, if you will, connecting to communities. And it started with being a CHR, well, the now defunct CHRY 105.5 FM York University's radio. So that's where sort of my wanting to have a voice, and I was a graduate student at the time, so let me be clear about that, with the public. So having done that, I began writing for other mediums and what I was passionate about. So I think that's one of the advice that I would give to folks listening. What are you passionate about? Because it's only through figuring out what you're passionate about that subsequently, I believe, lead to sort of accessible writing in the public. So for me, I started off, I remember writing a piece, an op-ed piece for the Toronto Star about something to do with the police way back, I think in the 90s. And then Subsequently, I wrote for Rabble.ca, Now Magazine, and then I had for 3 years, I had a column in a newspaper. So even though the topic wasn't necessarily related to my book, the topics that I focused on, so I wasn't writing about nurses. So my book is really about Caribbean and Black nurses in Canada, but there's all these other broader themes that run through the book. So I was writing about all of those themes at that point. And for me, I've always felt that the audience, the people outside, somebody I think asked, how do we define outside the academy? I'm talking about the ivory tower, right? So for me, it meant so much to me as a sort of Black Canadian person of Caribbean descent, walking. I tell people this all the time. When I was writing for Share newspaper, which is Canada's largest ethnic newspaper, when I walked down the street in this area we call it Little Jamaica, Eglinton Avenue, in Ontario, Toronto, North York, and people would come up to me. The folks on the street would come up to me and they'll say, I don't agree with you with that, but I agree with you with this. And that really mattered. It mattered so much to me, more than as Dr. Freeman pointed out, your mama and whoever else reading your book. So that has always mattered to me. So I want people to find out what your passion is. What is it that you care so much about that you want the public to know about your book or the topics? And yes, as Kara pointed out, Dr. Finnegan pointed out, that yes, I'm currently a fellow in the Public Voice Fellowship. And although I didn't publish with the project just yet, like I've published other articles, and so for folks, I would really recommend, if that's something you're interested in, to see if your institution supports it, or just figuring out on your own. And before I conclude my response to the question, I just want to read something really quickly, just a line from one of the nurses who read my book. So also when I write, I'm writing with the objective that the folks who I write about can read the book and understand it. And she says, this is from Frida Steele, and she's now deceased. But she says, thank you for effectively telling our stories. I stayed up Wednesday night until 2:30 a.m. reading your book. Needless to say, I was blurry-eyed the next day. So I want to write more for the public than I do for an academic audience. And my department, I think that University of Illinois presently is really trying to rethink what we call the COM9 to include public engagement broadly conceived.
Great, thank you. Thanks to all of you for those great answers. I'd like to turn now to the topic of virtual events and virtual conferences. So when the pandemic hit in March 2020 and scholarly conferences started being canceled, the University of Illinois Press pivoted to creating virtual exhibits on our website to coincide with the Society's virtual conferences. We rely on these conferences to meet new authors, display our books, sell our books, and so we felt it was important to create something in the digital space. So we created basically blog posts that included a variety of elements like new books, feature journals, free ebook giveaways, a connection to the acquisitions editors that typically would attend those meetings, and other things like that. So for virtual author events, we purchased a Zoom webinar license and began hosting our own book launches and symposia like this, where we're using Zoom webinar. And we found that these events, which because of they're not bound to geography, they typically attract more attendees than a single event would in person. So I think that's been a great learning experience and something that we will definitely carry forward post-pandemic. But my question for all of you is, have you participated in virtual events? Have they been a success? And how do you think about which organizations you want to partner with? So I think I'll start this time with Dr. Finnegan.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's you really hit it on the head, Michael. One of the things that's so interesting about this moment that we're in, right, which is so challenging in so many different ways, is that it can offer some different opportunities to not only rethink how you're doing things, but I think individual scholars are maybe seeing that they have additional opportunities that they might not have had otherwise. So last year, for example, I was invited to moderate a panel for the International Center for Photography in New York City. I'm pretty sure that they would not have flown me to New York City to moderate that panel. I would have been thrilled to spend some time there and hang out with them and do that in person, of course. But that's just kind of one example of how, you know, when you can think a little bit more broadly about who's out there and who might participate in your event, right, that gives those folks opportunities, but it also expands your own reach a little bit as an organization. One of the things that I belong to an organization called the Rhetoric Society of America, which is one of my disciplinary homes. And one of the things that they did that I thought was really skillful, and I've been able to participate both as a panelist and an audience, was their conference was canceled last May. They made a decision to not do a virtual version of the conference. It was kind of too soon to when the pandemic started for that to really be viable. And so they did a couple of things that I thought were really smart. The first thing they did was they created virtual versions of some of the events they would have had at the conference. So for example, a keynote speaker, an award ceremony, right? So to be able to recognize people in some kind of way. The second thing that they did, and I was able to attend and participate in one of these, is they created a series of, again, a kind of Zoom webinar structure where they invited folks to come and talk about a topic that wouldn't necessarily be the kind of topic that you would engage in a traditional conference presentation. So a few weeks ago, I had a really fun opportunity to participate in a conversation with 3 other scholars in that organization whom I never met, although I was familiar with some of their work. And we talked about creativity and scholarship. And we had a conversation that, you know, we all agreed if we had been in a live space would have been one of those conversations that, you know, transitions to dinner or to the hotel bar, because it was so engaging and energizing and people were making so many wonderful connections. So to the extent that the virtual space can offer something different than you might have in a traditional context, you know, I personally have found that to be really valuable.
Thank you. Dr. Flynn, can you share some of your virtual conference or event experiences with us?
Absolutely. So I've been incredibly busy, and that's partly a result of COVID-19 coupled with the death, unfortunate murder of George Floyd. So what has happened in terms of my virtual participation has been talking a lot about healthcare. So I spoke about COVID-19 and the impact on healthcare workers. So I was invited to talk about impact of healthcare workers in the Canadian context. Then I also did a podcast for SEIU Healthcare, the Canadian, it's North American Union, but for the Canadian folks, and another podcast. And then one thing that I'm most proud of during this time was I was invited to write an article for Gender and History around sort of healthcare. And I proposed to my colleague and friend, Kristen Bennett, that perhaps we should have a conversation. Again, for me, I want to always emphasize that I want to be talking to communities of folks. I don't want to have a conversation just with academics for academics. So, and again, this was enabled because of, you know, because of Zoom, basically, we could do this virtually. So I proposed to her that we have a communication, that I didn't necessarily want to do this by myself, that I wanted to do it in collaboration with an Indigenous scholar, and it happened. The Gender and History Journal was so great gracious that they did all of the work around facilitating this meeting that occurred in January, right before school start, January 14th. And we titled it Indigenous and Black Women's Standpoints on Care as a Strategy of Resistance and Continuance. And again, we had folks from the community, we had physicians, we had all kinds of people, about 70 people plus people showed up at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I feel like that in this moment, there's a lot of opportunities virtually to engage in ways that I'm not sure that I would have been able to had we not been in this unfortunate moment, but as it provided possibilities I feel I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Thank you. Dr. Freeman, can you share some of your experiences with virtual events around Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving?
Yes. So my original plan before COVID was Madam Walker lived in 7 different states. So I was planning a physical book tour through those states, and would also connect with community groups in those places and then some other along the way. So it ended up being like a 10-city tour was kind of the plan. But then COVID hit and that had to go out the door. And so I reached out to a friend of mine, Dr. Tanisha Ford, who's a historian at the City University of New York, who had a fabulous book tour a couple of years ago. I just said, how did you do that? And so she gave me a lot of tips. And so I just applied those. And basically one of her big tips was call in favors, call everybody you know, call the institutions, the community groups you think are very interested, and just put the word out there. And so partly working with my university, I'm grateful to my school. My school hosted the launch event on the day the book came out, which was great. But my vision was for the first 3 weeks after the book came out, I wanted to have at least one event every day and just kind of push it out. And Zoom made that possible. And so tonight, I just did a count. This is actually my 60th event related to the book. Since October. And it's been wonderful. And like Dr. Flynn said, most of it, there's been a few university communities there, but most of it has been grassroots, church congregations, giving circles, sororities, these kinds of groups. And it's been an incredible experience. And so part of it too, with being on social media and then sharing them on LinkedIn, or that they're coming up, or how to register. I also had a website that co-launched with the book. So word started spreading and people just started showing up. And so it was an incredible blessing. And I've gone coast to coast, Los Angeles to New York and Chicago to Texas. And even somebody from Spain reached out and said something, they loved the book. So, and then Dr. Flynn will be excited. I had a great conversation with the Black Canadian Fundraisers Network out of Ontario, founded by Nika Allen. So, I mean, you just be surprised. It started with, again, thinking about who is the audience, where might I find them? And it was always a dream for me to do the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. I reached out and ended up doing 3 events for the Smithsonian. And the last one was with the National African American Museum, which was just, dream come true. So I would say, think about those places you want to be. Where are those organizations? And they're just very gracious. They want to do this, and they want to have conversations, especially as a part of COVID, because just like my book tour plan got thwarted, their other plans got thwarted, but they still need to engage their communities or their members or their students or their whatever their stakeholder category is. And these were meaningful ways to develop conversations. So I was just blown away by the interest and the engagement. And then also within my field, recently, women of color have been organizing themselves in the world of philanthropy. And so there's some new professional associations that reached out to me and just embraced it and were just wonderful. I'm so, indebted to them too for all these wonderful conversations. And there were several repeat kind of follow-ups, because there were some places where it kind of bring you in to do just like a one night, but then others in, kind of just pitching, say, would you think that anybody would be interested in a conversation after having read the book? Or, they might have a little cohort who want to read the book and then ask you to come in. There's just so many different ways to do it. But I've been blown away by the response on Zoom. So definitely do that. I think if you can find other ways to promote it through a social media piece to let people know about it, call in favors, and then you find that the book takes on a life of its own. that just kind of, again, just amazes you, because you can start getting feedback from people. Like Dr. Flynn read that beautiful note from a reader. Things like that just start happening. That's when you know the book is out there and it's doing its thing.
Thank you. Dr. Burgos, what's your experience been with virtual events?
Yes, around Play Ball, we've done it several. It's great to have a partner like the Smithsonian and the lead curator of the project and my co-author, Margaret Salazar-Porzio. We've done a number of events. Starting back in September, we co-organized a webinar called Play Ball Now. And we had individuals from MLB, from the Society of American Baseball Research, and other, both Latinas and Latinos, to speak about their experience within baseball, but not from the playing field. And so part of what we were doing is reaching out to the community to talk about all the different ways that Latinas and Latinos, Latinx people have engaged in baseball. And so that's been a vital part of getting the word out. Just April's, it's the beginning of baseball season. Today's Jackie Robinson Day. So in addition to what's going on here, I've been, at least twice, maybe 3 times a week on media hits. That's why my background looks like the way it does, because I had experts tell me like, okay, turn the lighting here, move that over a little bit. So it's not all my creativity. I've had help. And I think one of the other things, and this touches on what Professor Flynn was noting, speaking to the issues of the day. So last summer, a group of scholars and baseball writers, we began to convene a series of webinars, and we branded it Say It Ain't Contagious, and to talk about COVID, to talk about its impact on sports, on activism, on Black Lives Matter, and really the intersection of sport, politics, race, and health. And we've kind of navigated now from being a webinar series to a series of podcasts, where every week we're recording, having guests and talking about the issues of the day, and really speaking to a public. As I believe it was Professor Flynn again was talking, like the question about inside and outside the academy, the audience really ought to be who will be affected by the story, who needs to hear the story that you have to share. And trust me, it's not just people in the academy, although sometimes the people in the academy really need to understand that story as much as folks, throughout. But writing, and I totally agree with what Professor Flynn was saying, writing in a manner that folks who are not PhDs, who are not the academic ilk, so they can access what you're sharing is important, both, I believe, in your scholarship, and then also when you're doing public-facing work. And for that reason, when I've had a number of invites to share my work, I think the blessing of COVID is that some folks are more willing to invite you to come in, because particularly small museums, smaller venues, community groups, because they don't have to put out an expenditure of great funds at all to have you collaborate. And I think we as scholars so want to engage people and different faces versus just the sometimes images of our students on Zoom classes as we teach. It's like we're seeing people and this is great. And also the conversation that happens afterward. So when we did this webinar with Play Ball Now, the Smithsonian book launch event, we had a great turnout. There was over 200 people who attended. And we had reserved 2 hours, and I was serving as the panel moderator. And the chat box was flowing so much that we just kind of shortened up our conversation so that we can engage the public. And I think that is the opportunity that is so different. When we give a book talk, sometimes we talk for 30 minutes and you might have 10, 15 minutes if you're fortunate, Q&A. Where you're on this kind of virtual format, oftentimes there is a better opportunity for an individual to engage the author or to engage the people on the panel. That kind of disrupts the traditional academic talk or the traditional book talk, that I think it's actually quite fortunate for us so that we can engage each other better.
That's great. Thank you. I want to turn now to some kind of individualized questions based on your individual books. And I guess I want to start with Dr. Freeman. You know, in observing your promotion and marketing of the book, it seemed like you made bulk sales sort of a purposeful part of those events. And you know, you had a lot of communication with the marketing department about creating materials that you could provide to the hosts and organizers. And I just wondered, like, how you thought about that as part of the event process or part of the planning process. You know, does it come from your academic background, or just kind of what was your thought process behind your approach?
Yeah, so it started with, there was actually a fundraising consulting firm that reached out and asked me to do an event for their kind of Midwest office, and they were going to offer an honorarium. And I just said, well, would you be interested in purchasing some books? And the press offers these wonderful discounts depending on volume, and so I did. I made up a nice little flyer that listed all the amounts and the rates, and then how to call Amy and all these things. So it just made it real simple. And so I just started regularly including that whenever people would approach me, or when I would go, you know, solicit folks and just say, hey, you know, would you be interested in doing this? And it was really interesting because usually they say yes, and sometimes they might only buy like 5 or 10. Others, you know, I had one that bought 70. So you just never know. Over time, that stuff adds up. But again, if you really, you know, to the things that many people have said, I was really excited. I'm passionate about this. I wanted to connect with my readers. I want people to have it. So that's why I started offering that. And so now it's kind of a regular part of when people reach out. We just kind of talk about, what are you trying, you know, what kind of event would you do, and would you want to make the book available to your participants? Well, here's some options, and the press can help you with that. So I would say don't shy away from that, and put it out there. Make some nice, you know, easy. It wasn't complicated. It's just a Word document in a PDF, and it just lists the rates and the contact information. But you know, and especially when you start getting to, you know, if there are book clubs or other groups that are having kind of professional development around your book, there's just these types of opportunities can come up, and you can suggest them. Or sometimes people will reach out and they're not quite sure what they want to do, so they want to kind of talk it through with me. And so, you know, so we just have ways of just kind of discussing, you know, different options and developing something that'll work for folks. So I would just say, you know, put it on your menu of what's available, and encourage people to do that.
And just a quick follow-up to that, did you find, I know that we've offered both print copies of the book and ebook copies. What's your sense of what the organizers are looking for between those two formats?
Yeah, you know, I would have to kind of go back and look, but I think, you know, there have been quite a few who bought the paperback, and I was surprised because, you know, they have to then redistribute them to their people, and which can be a little more complicated. But the other thing, because I'm in the world of fundraising and philanthropy, there have been quite a few places that have bought them for their donors or other supporters or their alumni. And so then they use those as kind of stewardship gifts and give them out to people. But more recently, it's been a lot of the ebooks, which can then easily just be emailed out to folks and that sort of thing, especially for the larger events. So I think it's probably been a mix during the past 6 months.
Great, thank you. Dr. Finnegan, you know, the first book that you published with the University of Illinois Press in 2015 was maybe more of a standard monograph. Mm-hmm. And the book that's coming out in May really is targeted toward a trade or general audience. And I just wondered, like, how you're thinking about promoting the new book is different based on the audience that you hope to reach.
Yeah, it's very different. I won't say much about this here because I know we're talking about promotion, but I also wrote the book very differently, right? With that in mind. And, you know, some of the other folks on this panel have talked about that, right? That writing with a particular audience in mind, that more general audience, or at least what we might call that non-academic audience, is really key. So I think that was kind of the first step. In terms of promotion, it's been really fun. I have really enjoyed learning and thinking strategically. My field of training in communication is rhetoric and persuasion, and I spend a lot of time being an expert on things like audience analysis. So the idea that I could take these skills that are my professional skills and put them into play has been really fun. And for me, I think a couple of things have been important. Probably the most important thing has been, I think, a lot of times when you think about the difference between an academic monograph and a trade book, you think that everyone will want to read it. So a trade book is a book that like everyone will be, picking up, and that'll be different from the academic book. And you still have to have a general, you can't just like write a book for everybody, right? No one will ever want to read that or let you publish it. So you really have to be clear early on about who are those general audiences. Who are the, we talked a little bit about this before, what are the kinds of things they read? What are the kinds of things they're interested in? And how can I link up to the stuff that they're already reading and doing and connecting with? So for me, I've kind of approached it from a perspective of three kinds of audiences. This is a book about the history of photography as told through the lens of the US presidency. So there are a lot of people who are very interested in presidents. Anything about presidents, they will buy, they will be interested in. And so I've been thinking a lot about where to find those folks and how to reach out to those folks. People who either do photojournalism or are interested in contemporary photography or the history of photography is another kind of general audience. And then the third audience is what I would call maybe a more general kind of people who like to read US cultural history. And that's maybe where the presidents and the photography stuff overlaps. So my strategy has really been to try to think about where are places where I can meet those different audiences. And then to what extent might I be able to kind of bring those audiences together through certain kinds of events? So for example, the University of Illinois Alumni Association very kindly invited me to do a talk, a virtual talk for them. One of the things that emerged from that was an alum attended that and then got in touch with me, and she said, hey, I run this photography museum in St. Louis. Do you want to come and do a version of this talk for us, right? So speaking to kind of a general alumni audience actually exposed me to people who kind of fit all those three profiles that I'm interested in thinking through and addressing.
Great, thank you. Dr. Burgos, I guess I want to ask you about your book is a dual language book, and I wondered what sort of opportunities and or challenges you see in promoting your book in a virtual space to a dual language audience.
Yeah, and I think here the really big challenge has been that we haven't been able to launch our exhibit as a physical exhibit at the Smithsonian. We were hoping that would do some of the front work in terms of getting it out. But we wrote it as a dual language book because we wanted the ability for, just imagine a family, multi-generational Latino family in particular, where the grandmother or grandfather could read the same book that their grandchild can read, and they can connect around the history, because to a certain extent, it's the history of them, or the way we like to talk about it, it's the history of us. And, we very intentionally sought to engage voices that in other spaces have not been heard from in a baseball book. So this is not an academic book. This is a coffee table, artifact-driven story book. And but some of those stories are stories like of Linda Alvarado, who's the owner of the Colorado Rockies, who went from owning a construction company to owning one of the Major League Baseball teams. And that's a story of a Mexican-American woman and the passion for baseball within that community. And where we have had, and I'm looking forward to, right now, the Castle Museum in Saginaw, Michigan is the first site to host the traveling exhibit. And we did a panel just 2 weeks ago. And we had members of the community participate live from the Castle Museum, who were themselves members of baseball teams that played, Latino baseball teams that played in Saginaw. And I think there we begin to see the power of bridging the academic and the community and making that the focal point, like very intentionally. And so there, although the audience in this instance, we all spoke English, but in other instances, it was a bilingual audience that we were able to field questions in either language and write in either language. And we had a great team that translated our writings over. And so the long answer can produce a shorter answer, which is we'll see coming this fall when we actually launch the exhibit as a physical entity. And then the collaborations, the travel exhibit will be moving about the country over the next 3-4 years. And there's actually a number of them that can travel, so that multiple museums. And our idea is to have it in both large cities, but in also smaller communities that can highlight the Latino stories in that community. When I say Latino community, many people might not think Saginaw, Michigan, but in fact, Saginaw Bay City has had a long history of Latino, mostly Mexican American, but some Puerto Ricans as well, in that community, from the farm work to the factory work at the various auto plants and auto part plants. And there is a powerful story of us through their lives that we can share more broadly. And that has been our aim. And also, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, have all generations of that family be able to share and connect to the story.
Thank you. And last question for Dr. Flynn before we go to the question and answer period. Your first book was published in 2011, so 10 years ago, and you're working on.
Don't remind me.
Yeah, and your new book. You're working on your new book, and I just wondered, like, what do you wish you knew in 2011 when that book came out, or what are you excited about being able to take advantage of in promoting your next book? What's changed that you'll be able to take advantage of in that marketing?
Okay, all right, thank you. So I felt that I left it really up to the press in some instances to market my book. I don't think that I would do that now, having access to LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook. So I think that's the first thing. I do also want to add that because my book is one of the first books to actually focus on Black women. You know, it was like I did a couple interviews on CBC in Toronto, CBC in Windsor, right? So it really, I was very fortunate and remain very fortunate to have had access to the media in that way. But at the same time, and that's something I was thinking about, I think that Dr. Freeman mentioned the different types, the ebook versus the actual book. So, and again, this is tied into audience. So the other day, I got an email from someone from the Ontario Nurses Association saying this book that is 10 years old, that they wanted 288 copies of the book for their members. So they were trying to purchase the book from a local bookstore, but the volume, they weren't able to do that. So I went and I looked on the website, and I noticed that the book was only in ebook form. And so I called up my acquisitions editor, because the week before, the SEIU, that same union, wanted to buy book, but they didn't want the e-version of the book because they wanted hard copies of the book. And so this is another issue, right? So for me, my audience, the working folk, right? They're nurses, they're healthcare workers. They're not necessarily sitting in front of a computer. So I did, University of Toronto Press was gracious enough to, I guess they published the copies that people needed. So I think that's also important, like important for me to think about moving forward. Something else that I learned, which I think our audience would be also interested in, I wrote this article on the pandemic. It was, the 1918 pandemics on Black Canadians. And I sent it into the editor for Origins, they're out of university, the Ohio State University. And the editor wrote back and said, oh no, your paragraphs are too long, right? And I was like, what do you mean my paragraphs are too long? Because I was one of those people that was taught, you don't write 3-sentence paragraphs, right? But what he ended up saying to me was that people are also reading on devices. And I was just like, okay, so people are reading on devices. So yes, there's a lot of visual, right? So for me now, the second book, I'm gonna have a lot more pictures of my interlocutors in the book, thinking about what this editor, Nicholas had said about when, the kind of audience, right? Who will be reading the second book, but also when we're writing for the public to sort of move beyond these long, I had these, 8-line paragraphs to make our paragraphs much more shorter for people who are on, who are on these, iPhones and Androids and so forth. So I'm excited. I have a contract with the University of McGill Queen's Press. I'm excited to finish this particular book. And I think that'll just be very different from 10 years ago. And I was like, look, I'm tired. Okay, y'all take care of this because I don't really want to have anything to do with it. Just market it for me because I'm done. It's been forever. So yeah, I will approach my marketing with fresh eyes and new energy. That I'm excited about my project.
So thank you all for the answers to those questions. We do have some questions from the audience I'd like to get to. Dr. Freeman, you mentioned that let me see. You mentioned that one get a team that can help them. Who all did you have on your team in terms of disciplines, professions?
Yeah, so let me just say, this can be exhausting. So it's fun and it's lovely and I wouldn't give it up, but be kind to yourself. And, 4 months before, while I was planning all these things out, say, oh, I could do 3 Zooms in a day. What could go wrong there? What's the problem with that? But, between the links and just being tired, it's labor. You're sharing something you love, but it's labor. You're thinking, you're responding to questions. Sometimes they want you to formally present, other times it's a conversation. There could be different formats. And so I would say, so I needed a team. This is, again, something that Tanisha told me, get your team together. So I reached out to the media folks at my university, and I just said, hey, can I talk to you? Here's what I'm planning. I would love to get your thoughts. And they were gracious. They met with me several times. And this is at the university level. Inside my school, we're a little unique. We have a media relations team inside our school, which has helped us kind of build our field of philanthropic studies. And so I connected with them, and they were gracious enough, and they helped with many of these op-eds and these kinds of things. So I was kind of thinking about, because I couldn't afford a publicist, and that wasn't going to work. So I wanted to leverage the existing relationships that were very helpful. And the other person is a speaking agent, and most of these things are free. Every now and then there's been an opportunity to do something more, but a speaking agent has helped me to organize these things, and she keeps track of the links and the timing and all, and I just have to show up. So those kinds of things are very helpful. So those are the people, the media folks, and then someone to help with the speaking part of it and to manage the events.
Thank you. Let's see, trying to get to the next question here. So a question comes in for Michael as exhibitor and panelists as authors. At on-site conferences, there was often an unspoken but sometimes explicit border between the exhibit hall where promotion was permitted and panels where it was not. At off-site meetings, if there's a virtual exhibit hall, this may still be in effect, but when there isn't, should this boundary be more flexible? And the questioner says, I was at a war conference in Texas last weekend without any exhibits, and I tried to share promo discounts for publishers. So any comments on when you've attended conferences yourself, where that line is between kind of the exhibit hall and what's appropriate for selling or promoting, and kind of in the areas where there are papers being given where it might not be as appropriate. Does anyone want to take that?
I'm all about flexibility and breaking down these kinds of boundaries. So I'm a member of the Caribbean Studies Association and also the chair of the Author Celebration Committee. And so in that venue, we actually have the folks who we're celebrating bring their books, and they often do bring in the discounts for the books, and that's perfectly acceptable. I personally don't see why that should be a problem. I know in a lot of spaces where I've had my first book that the press, I remember at University of Windsor, and brought in, I gave a talk, and obviously this is not the same as a conference, but I do think that we should actually open up these spaces and move beyond these kinds of binaries, because it's all in service of the same thing anyway. At least that's how I see it.
And as an exhibitor, I honestly, I'm usually tied to that exhibit space and don't really have an opportunity to go into the rooms where they're giving papers. So I can't speak to that experience, but obviously totally appropriate to promote books and authors in that exhibit space. Another question, how much have you used social media for your book marketing? What has been most effective? So anybody who just wants to jump in and share maybe how they've used social media and what they found to be the most effective use.
I could talk a little bit about kind of my plans, right? I mean, I've got my book coming out in the next month. And so one of the things I'm thinking about is how to promote the book, how to share information about the book launch, which will be a virtual event that's organized by the press, how to share information about the other things I'm doing where people from the general public, might be able to attend. So I want to get that out there, but I'm also trying to be thoughtful about not spamming people. I think we probably all have that friend who shall remain anonymous who all they share on social media is that stuff, right? And so I was listening to a podcast where some nonfiction authors were talking about this question of the value of promotion versus the value of what you do on social media more generally. And one of the women basically said, I make sure that my self-promotion is one of every 4 or 5 things I post, right? And I've sort of kept that ratio in mind. I mean, not necessarily because that's a magic number, but just that idea of, for me, if you're going to be on social media and you're going to engage with people, if you're only engaging to get people to look at your stuff and you're not really engaging more broadly, then that's an issue. I'm not somebody who is on Twitter, for example. I'm doing a lot of political back and forth conversation. I tend to be more of a kind of broadcaster on Twitter. And so I try to be careful that my broadcasting is amplifying the work of others, bringing other people into the conversation that, on a topic that I'm interested in, that kind of thing. So, so social media to me is really important. My work is on photography. So one of the things I'm really thinking about is Instagram. I have a professional Instagram account where a lot of photographers follow me, and I follow them, and a lot of people in that universe. And so I'm trying to think about them as a distinct audience and how I might reach them there. So I'm still learning and what are the best ways to do that? But those are just some of my personal rules, I guess, or guidelines.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I did see something pop up in the chat about bookmarks and whether they're still used. I'll just say from the press side, we do produce bookmarks for authors. I feel like we've been maybe doing fewer lately because there are less public events for the authors to distribute those bookmarks and fewer events for us to distribute bookmarks. We typically distribute those at conferences and book festivals and book fairs, but we still do produce those if an author expresses interest in having that. And the last question, thank you for sharing your exciting work. Could you speak to how new and emerging scholars who are often encouraged to seek out academic publishing for the job market might approach public-facing publication and when? Can anyone speak to that?
Well, this is a good question, and particularly Kara and I have at various moments served on this committee task force at the University of Illinois, talking about public-facing work and how do we, as a university, recognize that important work that faculty members are doing. And I think, you know, being strategic about it is very important in terms of I don't think there's a fine line between self-promotion and public-facing work. You should be public-facing to share the scholarly insights you have with a broader audience. And because they are likely to, so to be a little bit autobiographical, because I was on Twitter, I received an invitation years ago to start writing as a contributor to sporting news. And partly it was because I used my scholarly research as a basis to talk in a public-facing way about the issues of race, about the issue of immigration, and how that affected Latinos in sports. And that was a voice that wasn't out there. And so they approached me. And think about how your scholarship provides you an entree via the unique voice of what you're doing to engage the public. And they will turn that around. Someone will see this is a voice that's missing, and will engage you in that manner. And so there are communities that need that voice and that will come to you. And so that's a way of thinking about it personally. Now, the other question is about how, whatever university you are at and how to recognize that. And I would reach out to colleagues both in your college and in your department and have a conversation about how to make sure that that important work that you will be doing is recognized as who you are as a scholar, and that is part of how you'll be assessed as your impact. Most universities want a scholar who has impact. Well, this is how part of the way you have impact.
So thank you. We'll close there. I just want to say to all the panelists, you were fantastic. I'm proud to have been on a panel with you. So thank you for giving your time today to the Marketing in a Virtual World panel. And also I want to thank all of the attendees for coming. I'm sorry we couldn't get to some of your questions, but thank you for participating in the University of Illinois Press Spring 2021 Symposium, and we will be sharing the video of this panel in the days to come. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.